They had everything going for them: height, skill, high draft pick status. The NBA and the media sold these players as future icons, heroes of the sport. But when the curtain fell, scenes of humiliation, silence, and oblivion spread, mistakes that a powerful league chose to hide. This video will reveal the minds and careers that the NBA tried to bury. Anthony Bennett, the pick that shocked the world and never worked. On June 27, 2013, something historic and at the same time bizarre happened. The Cleveland Cavaliers, even though they were aware of other talents in the draft, announced Anthony Bennett as the first overall pick. Bill Simmons reacted live with a whoa. Echoing the national shock, Bennett, described as surprised even by himself, became the symbol of Cavalier hope after the LeBron era. The story seemed set in stone. A promising young man, standing at an impressive 6'2", coming out of UNLV, with an athletic body and a convincing offensive repertoire. But all that quickly collapsed like a house of cards. Upon arriving at summer camp, Anthony was already out of shape, 15 pounds over the ideal weight for a professional athlete. His lack of conditioning was evident, and his work ethic was soon questioned. His debut was catastrophic, 0 of 16 on shots, a shocking number that echoed across social media and critical headlines. He finished his only season in Cleveland with modest averages: 4.2 points, 3 rebounds, and no starts in 16 games. GM David Griffin later admitted, "We didn't know deep down that he didn't have adversity from the first obstacle." He gave up. Discredited and lacking confidence, Bennett was traded to Toronto, then to Minnesota, and finally ended his NBA journey in 2017 without ever finding his place. His career was limited to an average of 4.4 points in 12 minutes per game. The decimation of expectations culminated in the worst of shadows being forgotten. Meanwhile, Giannis Antetokounmpo, chosen only 15th, became NBA champion and global icon of the NBA. Cleveland's choice was a historic mistake, and Anthony paid the price. The media preferred to blame the choice, the coaching staff, the trainers, but almost no one pointed out the failure of the emotional evaluation system. Physical and mental monitoring of a young man at the height of his confusion. Bennett, without emotional and physical preparation, saw his confidence collapse. Even attempts at physical rehabilitation were not enough to alleviate the psychological damage. The NBA remained silent. The press acted with modesty and quickly forgotten. Anthony became a meme, labeled as the worst #1 pick of all time. A caricature created by a political and commercial decision, not by sports analysis or real potential. Today he plays in minor leagues Turkey, Taiwan. He lives far from the NBA cameras, far from the spotlight of the national media. He played the role of ostracism. His story shows how fragile the process of selling an athlete as a hero is, without solid foundations, emotional education, and full support. The castle collapses and the fall happens with profound impacts on the identity and personal future of young people who dreamed too big. What can we learn from Bennett? That the draft is not just about physical projection, it is a hypothesis of emotional resistance, maturity, resilience. The American system bet on image and forgot to protect the person. The result: individual damage, and a collective lesson that time insists on erasing. Greg Oden, from #1 prospect to invisible collapse. Gregory Wayne Oden Jr. was born on January 22, 1988 in Buffalo, New York, and grew up in Indianapolis, carrying the weight of a colossal promise from an early age. At 17, he was seen as one of the biggest talents in high school. His 7'1" height, combined with surprising ability for a center, intrigued coaches and fans alike. When he arrived at Ohio State in 2006, he quickly emerged as a dominant player, All-American, Defensive Player of the Year, and key player in the Big Ten title. His future was so bright that, to many, it seemed like obvious predictions. Triumphant entrance into the NBA, imposing physique, long career, and unquestionable success. In 2007, selected #1 in the draft by the Portland Trail Blazers, Oden seemed destined to rewrite the team's history, chosen ahead of Kevin Durant. But a ghost haunted him. Man inherited physical imbalance, one leg shorter than the other, requiring special care since high school. A few months after the draft, his traitorous body manifested itself with a microfracture in his right knee, forcing him to undergo surgery and miss the entire 2007-08 season. The expectation was that at age 19, with proper treatment, he would return stronger. But that surgery was only the first of 7 knee surgeries, paving the way for a devastating series of injuries. His return was euphoric. In 2008 and 9, he played in 61 games, averaging 8 points and 7 rebounds per game. There seemed to be hope, but soon the pain returned. Another surgery on his left knee, more months of rehabilitation. With each surgery, hope faded. In a sad cycle, frustration grew, and, with it, dependence on alcohol and painkillers. Oden admitted, "I practically became an alcoholic by the second season." He drank to celebrate victories few and to drown the frustrations of defeats and injuries. As his body broke down, his mind also crumbled. Oden fell into a deep state of depression. He isolated himself at home, often not even leaving his room. He was born a giant, but he felt small, useless, a walking failure. He himself confessed, "I hated life. I wanted to kill everyone," reflecting an anger that was born of frustration with the system, with fate, with himself. He was released by Portland in 2012, with only 82 games played and a broken legacy. In 2013, he got a chance with the Miami Heat, playing only 23 games, averaging fewer minutes. He was part of the team that reached the 2014 finals, but his participation was symbolic, less than a minute per game in the 2 playoffs played. Some say he was the biggest bust in history, but veterans remember, when healthy, he was a phenomenon: solid defense, dominating presence, innate intuition near the rim. But his body didn't cooperate. Multiple surgeries and infections prevented him from playing. An early, poorly directed treatment destroyed the potential of a young man who never had peace with his physique. The transition after the NBA was brutal. Odin, who always defined himself as a dominant center, found himself lost. He even played in China for a season, but the physical problems remained, and in October 2016, at just 28 years old, he announced his definitive retirement. Ohio State officials remember his first days back on campus. He didn't know where to go or what to do. He felt a profound emptiness. He described a whole month in which he didn't talk to anyone, had no plans, no purpose, and lived dependent on alcohol to sleep and painkillers to ease the pain. Back home, he struggled with depression and the consequences of a self-destructive lifestyle. Leaked intimate photos, a fight with his ex-girlfriend, and a criminal assault charge. He pleaded guilty, received probation, and committed to therapy. And Alcoholics Anonymous, the system that designed, sold, and discarded him, never offered a post-career plan. The NBA invested in his image, but not in his mind. The franchises treated his body like a machine. They used him until he broke. Odin, an introverted soul, was left in emotional exile. There was no transition program, no psychological counseling. He found himself alone in the void that basketball filled. Years later, Odin returned to college and graduated in 2019 with a degree in sports industry from Ohio State. In 2022, he was hired as the director of operations at Butler University, rebuilding his identity and dealing with the memories of what he had lost: confidence, reputation, financial future. Greg himself said, "If I was healthy, I'd be a decent player." But the point is, no system, no draft analysis aims at that. They choose body, hype, statistics. Odin was too human to survive the spotlight without real support. Today, he is a living symbol of a silenced mental breakdown. The biggest draft fiasco didn't happen overnight. It was preceded by years of neglect, systemic failures, and an aura of active oblivion. He's not the only one. He's the first one to be remembered. A giant who couldn't stand up on his own. Darko Milicic, the scepter that never shined. Darko Milicic was born on June 20, 1985 in Novi Sad, in what was then Yugoslavia, into a family context marked by war. His father was presumed dead during the conflict, before turning up alive. What fractured by the violence of the world. Darko's childhood was filled with uncertainty, but his talent for basketball emerged as a powerful light, a shield against the chaos. At the age of 14, he was already a promising prospect. At 17, he had impressed scouts in European tournaments. The Detroit Pistons, coming off a title with a defensive focus and experience, saw in Darko a versatile giant compared to Wilt Chamberlain, and selected him second overall in the 2003 draft, behind only LeBron James, but ahead of icons such as Carmelo Anthony, Chris Bosh, and Dwyane Wade. The world was waiting for a new titan, but Darko, at just 18 years old, was raw and tragically unprepared. He described the initial training as chaotic and became fatigued during simple half-court drills. Still, the Pistons secured him, selling him as a future dominator, but dominator of hype, not of the game. The team was already strong. The greatest demand was immediacy, and Darko never had time to evolve. There was no patience. His moments were on the bench, in secondary plan. Except for occasional appearances in finals, he was the youngest NBA champion, at 18 years old. Ready when not ready. Darko subsequently went to Orlando, then Memphis, New York, Minnesota, and even Boston, without ever finding rhythm, space, confidence. The numbers show little: an average of 6 points and 4 rebounds per game, in 10 years spread across 6 teams. The service may point out promising talent, but within the locker room, Darko was seen as immature, insubordinate, often drunk before training, and combative with his teammates. He himself confessed that he drank before training sessions, mocked Ben Wallace, and, when he failed, blamed the world. But today, he admits that his pride was his downfall. Darko declared, "I should have called myself Darko, but my ego called me God. I was an arrogant, immature." The system that raised him sold his image, but did not offer education, acceptance, or adaptation. He was thrown into a hostile environment, without emotional structure. The pressure, the rejection, the dream of learning every day. Everything became a burden. He rebelled, isolated himself, drowned himself in alcohol, and instead of supporting him, the NBA dismissed him and continued to ignore his stumble. No one condemned him, no one welcomed him. He became a mutant. Shadow. Today, Darko is a farmer, He grows apples and lives a simple life in Serbia. He claims to have found peace among the orchards, but admits that remorse and regret still live within him. He recounts it was only when he left, really walked away, that he understood the damage and took the blame. The system is cruel if you don't perform, but I was the problem. His mental breakdown was hushed up. The failure became a joke for the fans, a scar on his soul, and the neglect, a lesson for the sports system that made him an example of what happens when a prodigy is born, without the emotional support and maturity to handle fame. Darko Milicic represents the opposite of the sports narrative, the carousel that never turns into victory, a target of hype who became hostage to cruel expectations and a league that forgot him until the day he fell silent. Kwame Brown, the controversial choice that became a symbol of silenced era. Kwame Sani Brown was born on March 10, 1982, in Charleston, South Carolina, but grew up in Brunswick, Georgia, in a difficult social environment marked by violence, drug trafficking, and family instability. He and his siblings witnessed constant police raids, racial issues, poverty, and a precarious education, elements that shaped his worldview, his emotional defenses, and his understanding of success and survival. He said, "Kicked down our door 40 times, summing up the chaos experienced in the nuclear family at Glynn Academy. His talent was explosive, with impressive averages in his teens to 20 points, 13 rebounds, almost 6 blocks per game. He became a national star, compared to icons who went straight from high school to the NBA. He reached his peak when he was selected number 1 overall in the 2001 draft by the Washington Wizards. He thus became the first player to enter the team straight out of high school as the No. 1 pick. The pick was celebrated as the redemption of a declining franchise, led by Michael Jordan as president. But there was an invisible strategy behind. Its sources indicate that Jordan had considered trading Brown for Elton Brand. And when the deal fell through, Morgan and his neighbors saw Brown as a leftover from the plan. In addition, he ended up in a franchise that didn't really believe in his potential. Jordan and coach Doug Collins prioritized veterans and immediate victories, and disregarded youngsters. Collins in fact hoped he would be traded, saying he never believed in the kid. Kwame entered the Wizards' locker room as a promising prospect, but the pressure was immediate, suffocating. He was forced to gain weight before he even learned to move freely. The result? He lost speed and confidence, and paid the price. In his rookie season, modest averages 4.5 points, 3.5 rebounds were interpreted as a lack of talent. He soon began to be labeled a bust, a word that increasingly destroyed his self-esteem and identity. The environment was unforgiving. Gilbert Arenas, a former teammate, revealed that Kwame got to the point of getting drunk before and after games, an escape from emotional oppression. The press dismissed his origins, forgetting that he was a teenager adopted by the sports elite. He said, "If you watch me, even when I make a good play, I wouldn't even celebrate." The psychological impact was profound. Public criticism only increased. He began to wither mentally. The weight of the word bust was unforgiving. "Everything I say now is invalidated by that word," he lamented. It was incomprehensible that a kid with no human support, only pressure, was treated as a mere statistic. When he was traded to the Los Angeles Lakers, the atmosphere was hostile. Fans shouted, "You should be glad you're traded," with every touch of the ball. His career spanned 12 seasons with several teams: Pistons, Bobcats, Warriors, 76ers, with reasonable averages, 6.6 points, 5.5 reb. Despite this, the stigma persisted. He was never seen as a king, only as an example of what the NBA wanted to forget. Al Harrington, a longtime teammate, defended him. He was a legit NBA player. He lasted 13 years, but the dominant narrative denied his value, leaving his resilience in the background. Kwame had misdiagnosed injuries such as a tendon avulsion, which should have been treated surgically and not with therapy, and directly blames the Sixers medical department for shortening his career. He also revealed that Jordan and Collins humiliated him, bringing him close to veterans only to be harassed, without emotional preparation. After retiring in 2013, he still faced media silence. Financial problems led him to bankruptcy in 2010. Today, he defends his name on social media in YouTube videos, explaining that it wasn't impossible, that the media distorted his legacy and ignored his humanity. The emotional accounts of fans on Reddit show empathy. One comment says, "He plays with a pressure I'd say LeBron James could only relate to. I think the fact that he didn't have a breakdown is admirable." Another reinforces if MJ didn't return, he'd have a chance to learn from his mistakes and grow as a player. Today, Kwame is a figure in the Big Three and comments on the narrative with frankness. Being a bust is better than being in the constant spotlight. He grew up, changed the narrative, and assumed his truth. But the emotional damage, the public shame, the institutional abandonment, the weight of being synonymous with failure cannot be erased. Kwame Brown represents the NBA dirty mistake, sold as a star, but torn apart by a system incapable of recognizing vulnerabilities. And today, once again, we understand players are not unlimited commodities. They are human, and wrong choices, even when based on logic, can become traumas that echo for decades. Michael O. Kande. From silent giant to voiceless void, Michael Oluokandi was born on March 3, 1975, in Lagos, Nigeria, raised by a single mother in a humble environment marked by a strict culture that values discipline, respect, and collective effort. At age 12, he was sent to the United Kingdom to study as a boarding school, a world away from the streets of Nigeria, a culture shock that began to shape the introspective man he would become. His nearly 7'1" frame and long arms quickly caught the eye of the basketball player, and he was recruited by Pacific University, where he excelled as a defender, blocker, and intimidating presence. But along with his giant frame came a shyness that took on psychological overtones. On June 13, 1998, the Los Angeles Clippers selected Michael with the first overall pick in the draft, a controversial decision. He was chosen ahead of talents such as Paul Pierce and Dirk Nowitzki. The press and fans initially saw a giant ready to transform a declining franchise, but the Clippers were a sea of mismanagement, unstable coaching, and lack of structure. Michael was thrown into the chaos of one of the worst organizations in the NBA, and without guardians who understood his needs. The beginning was promising. In his first season, he recorded 8.9 points, 8.3 rebounds, and 2.3 blocks per game. But the lack of support, the pressure for immediate results, and the constant change of coach and management began to affect him emotionally. He was the face of the rebuilding, but he had no psychological support. The silence of his mind, his shyness, and his difficulty in dealing with the spotlight made him an easy target for cruel criticism. The bad games and injuries began to appear, and with them, the weight of failed expectations. Michael began to be treated as a bad choice. Throughout his career, the media ridiculed him as Oluokandi, comparing him to a soldier with no soul, no personality, no drive. The cruel term stuck. Sports commentators didn't limit themselves to the numbers. They laughed at his lack of expression, associating it with supposed laziness. But his mind was melancholic, suffocated by guilt and shame at being the symbol of an organization's failures. Oluokandi struggled with depression. He felt responsible for rescuing a city from a sports nightmare, unable to fulfill its part of the bargain. Osteochondral and knee injuries kept him away, but it was in his head that the wound hurt the most. He admitted years later that this was his worst battle, a sad-eyed first father, demanding a return from him that he didn't know how to deliver. Without emotional support, access to therapy, or ongoing monitoring, he was pushed into several trades, to the Minnesota Timberwolves, Memphis Grizzlies, and Boston Celtics. In each new home, the same cycle: false expectations, technical instability, and lack of psychological care. He was treated like a worn-out product, without human reconditioning. Michael's finances also suffered. Without guidance, he lost much of the money he had earned and saw his reputation torn apart. Still, he tried to reinvent himself after the NBA. He invested in sports, startups, filmography, and even tried his hand at acting. But the shadow of biggest draft failure remained. He preferred to stay away from sports and the media. He became a discreet consultant, far from the spotlight. Oluokandi only became aware of his fragility when he saw the reflection of his body in the mirror, a bankrupt, thin giant without prospects, with a wounded soul. The autobiography he wrote, never published, spoke of sleepless nights, nightmares, and hopelessness. He said, "I never knew how to talk about my emotions. I was thrown into the fire without gloves." He was a giant who never had the courage to show that he was afraid. Today, he lives in California with his family. He rebuilt his mind with psychologists in silence, far from the media noise. All that remains for him is the dignity of knowing that he did his best in an impossible environment. He became a symbol of the fact that raw talent is not enough without emotional support, structure, and respect for the human being. Even the giant falls silent. Michael Oluokandi was not just a draft mistake. He was a human being lost in a system that exploited him, traded him, and then ignored him. And this abandonment was the invisible collapse that the NBA chose not to expose. He disappeared from the radar, but his silence screams his emotional scars. Hasheem Thabeet, a giant who never had a chance. Hasheem Thabeet was born on February 16, 1987, in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. In a culture where basketball was ignored, he was a gangly giant, discovered by chance at age 15, a teenager who we saw a game on the street and wanted to give it a try. Who would have thought that a kid who barely spoke English would become the second overall pick in the 2009 NBA draft? The media made him an instant celebrity, but no one prepared his mind for what was to come. At the University of Connecticut, he was a defensive wall, 4.2 blocks per game, co-leader in individual blocks, intimidating presence in the paint, Big East Player of the Year, Elite 8 star, a defensive giant. Everything seemed set up for stardom, but it soon became clear that something vital was missing: support for his psychological adaptation in Memphis. Thabeet was received as a promising player, but 7 feet 3 inches is not just height. It requires tactical understanding, physical preparation, and cultural adaptation. But he arrived with low mobility, inexperienced in rhythm, and no understanding of the NBA's space and systems. It was a shock. The Grizzlies' rush, eager for results, was fatal. He was relegated to the D-League, became a painful joke. The second pick working in the development league while Harden and Curry shone about 5 picks later. Between the lines, his mind collapsed. Instead of emotional guidance, he received labels: bust, disaster. Imagine being only the 6th tallest man to ever step foot in the NBA, but not mastering even the basics of the pick. The press didn't hold back. Trash team laughs. No one remembered that he was a 20-year-old immigrant with no cultural or psychological support. Thabby passed through Rockets, Blazers, Thunder, always as a temporary blocker, without development behind the scenes. The talents advised he is a hard worker, good character, but no one called psychologists. No one stopped to understand. He was abandoned by a league that needed marketing, not human coaching. The void screamed when he went to the G League in Japan, trying to prove that he could play. But the guilt, emotional trauma, and rejection corrode inside. He talked about being mentally broken for not living up to expectations. Imagine carrying a lifetime of expectations in a backpack that breaks and no one bothered to fix it. Today, Thabit still trains, still tries to make a comeback, not for the spotlight, but for the need to prove that a giant can rise again. He dreams of a defensive comeback, lost honor in being comeback defensive player of the year. He remains faithful to his roots, ready to rebuild his life away from the relentless label. Hasheem Thabit is the living contradiction of the late draft, sold as a savior. He became a shadow, a victim of a system that sold his body and forgot about his mind. He symbolizes how many physical giants there are emotionally fragile, how many talented immigrants are abandoned in the rush for the spectacle. This is not just a bust, it is a story of human fragility that the NBA ignored. Promises were sold on the hype of the drafts, but the emotional pillars were not sustained. The bodies shone, but the minds shattered. What about you? Were you fascinated by these stories? Do you want more dark truths behind the stars? Then, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss in-depth explanations about the flaws of the sports system. Like the video to strengthen the debate about emotional and mental support for athletes. Share it with as many people who love basketball and with those who believe that the sport is about people, not just numbers. Veterans, rookies, promises of the future are not disposable products. They deserve care, emotional education, psychological support as much as they deserve physical ability. And if the NBA doesn't see this, we should denounce it. Because emotional collapse is not an athlete's failure, it's a system's failure. See you in the next video, where we will expose more lies hidden in the shadows of the league. Thanks for watching.